what happens when we die. The Egyptian view is very interesting. For thousands of years, the Egyptian culture was very stable, and the central focus of that culture was the afterlife. One of the great documents that has come out of that culture is the Egyptian Book of the Dead, which goes into very great lengths to describe the journey of the soul after death. And of course, the enormous economic activity in ancient Egypt had to do with embalming and building pyramids and so on. The Greeks thought the Egyptians were far too focused on the afterlife and death. But one of their ideas of the Egyptians is that the soul is not a single entity. The Egyptians had 10 different words for different aspects of the soul. And the idea is that they might have different destinies. It's possible, at least, to consider that when you die, some part of you might be reincarnated as one person, and another part of you might break away and be reincarnated as part of a different person. You can look at biological organisms in which this sort of thing happens. Colonies of cells, for example, that divide up. A cell can divide up into many other cells. And reincarnation might work that way. I can't say it's conclusive, but it's certainly worth speculating on. We have very good scientific evidence at this point. I regard it as scientific, even though you can't yet reproduce it in the laboratory, but clear empirical observations. Let me put it that way. We're not at the point of reproducing reincarnation in the laboratory, but we have many good qualified observations that young children, for example, report memories of past lives. So it is good reason to think that some people, at least, reincarnate. In the University of Virginia Department of Perceptual Studies, they have a database of some 2,700 individuals who were young children, and almost as soon as they can begin to talk, they describe their past lives. So we might say we've got evidence that of the 27, I think it's 1,700 were what are regarded as solved cases, which means that the information provided by these young children was sufficient for researchers or family members to actually locate and identify the person who the child is talking about, that they say they were in a past lifetime. So you might say we got empirical evidence that 1,700 individuals have reincarnated. It doesn't mean everybody will reincarnate, or that, here's the thing, part of you might reincarnate and another part of you might move to a higher plane in the afterlife, which according to the accounts of we get through mediumship and other channeling and other resources, people who have been dead sometimes for decades come back and start describing what it's like, the different stages they go through. So to my way of thinking, it's entirely possible that an individual, a great soul like a William James, might be divided up and might express itself in multiple people. And in fact, there are accounts after William James died, there are numerous accounts coming from mediums and channelers of people who feel they're in touch with William James. So if you take them all seriously, and I'm not sure that we should, because I haven't studied them in detail to get a sense of their authenticity, I think it's a possibility that it works that way. Other people would disagree with me. They would say that the idea of the self, a unitary self that goes from past life to past life, that's the way it works. And all I can say is at this point, we don't have enough data to know what it's like. I expect when I look at the many different accounts of the afterlife, I expect that there are more possibilities than we can even imagine.
From your cases, have you identified any uniform processes that occur after death?
Yeah, there are many patterns that can be observed from the accounts that we have. I mean, 1,700 solved cases is actually a fairly large number. I can tell you, for example, that most of those cases involve males. And most of those cases involve a violent death of the previous person, which I think is more likely to occur if you were a male in a previous life. You're more likely to have had a violent death than if you were a female. And also, it does seem as if the sex is the same in 90% of the past lives, and about 10% people apparently change sex, which has led some researchers to speculate that cases of homosexuality, cases of trans, like what we call today trans, people who feel that they are born in a body which doesn't represent how they feel in terms of their gender, that those cases may be people who recently transitioned from one gender to another. So there's some interesting theorizing along those lines. Those are some of the main things we know, but we can also say that the personalities do seem to be similar from lifetime to lifetime. The traditional religious idea of karma, that if you're a bad person in one lifetime, you're going to be punished for it in the next lifetime, that doesn't seem to be supported by the empirical evidence that we have right now. But it does seem to be the case that the tendencies that you had in a previous lifetime, both your desires, your interests, your personality, your occupational tendencies, those seem to carry forth. It's what the Hindus would call samskaras, the tendencies that you bring with you, the tendencies that you have when you die are carried forward. So there is a sense that you are largely the same person from lifetime to lifetime, based on the limited database that we have.
Can you please elaborate on the differences in reincarnation studies between Eastern and Western cultures? I remember a discussion about those in Southeast Asia, where the belief in reincarnation is widespread. That is, they tend to come back quicker. Is that correct?
It is correct that the cases of reincarnation that come from Asia, and the bulk of cases do come from Asia, in countries where reincarnation is accepted, the interim period between lives is shorter on average. It could be, I think, on average, maybe just a matter of months between the death of one individual and the birth of the next life. And in the Occident and in Western cultures, it could be years. So there is a real difference, but there's a limited number of cases. And one of the most famous cases in the Western literature is the James Leininger case, where he had a vivid memory of having died in World War II and then was reborn decades later. So, because there's a small number of cases and one or two cases like that with decades in between, it really makes the average of the Western cases much longer. I don't know that we have enough data yet to draw a firm conclusion about it, but from the data we do have, it certainly appears as if there's a distinction between the Oriental and the Occidental cases.
How does your belief about what may happen after death relate to what actually happens? I know you surmise that we can affect what occurs after death via our beliefs. How do we know if any of this is true?
Yes. Professor Jeffrey Kripal, a wonderful philosopher and chair of the Religious Studies Department at Rice University, has made this point exactly, that the afterlife is dependent upon how we think about it and how our cultures seem to think about it. The way I view it is that there's a very thin boundary between our physical existence and the afterlife. You might say the way I did some very interesting interviews with Stephanie Stevens, a Jungian psychologist, who explained from the Jungian point of view, the afterlife is part of the collective unconscious that we experience, that we're so close to it. For example, my dream of Uncle Harry. Many people report visitations from deceased friends and relatives in their dreams. The boundary is that thin. And she notes Jung himself, when he describes a dream, he'll often say, this deceased person visited me in a dream, very specifically, rather than saying, I had a dream about such and such a person. It wasn't just a dream image. Jung seemed to be very clear that he could distinguish between visitations from the deceased versus a dream of the deceased. So that seems to be the boundary between everyday consciousness and the afterlife. It's a very thin boundary. And Carl Jung, in particular, developed the technique of active imagination as a way to explore the boundary. At some point, as you're imagining what it might be like, you move from the realm of imagination into what the philosopher Henri Corbin called the realm of the imaginal. The imaginal realm is very subtle. It's not physical, but it is very real. It would be like when Seneca appeared to me in my hypnotic experience and said, study my life. I only learned from studying his life that there was something very real. Those were his last words. So Henri Corbin, for example, became a Sufi, part of Islamic mysticism. And he was very interested in studying the Sufi philosophy of illumination as developed by the 12th century mystic Suhrawardi. And he felt that he had entered into an imaginal world in which Suhrawardi came to him, taught him directly the teachings of illumination. So that would be an example where imagination leads to something that is more real than mere fantasy.
If you enjoyed this toe clipping, then the full video is linked in the description. You should also sign up for Toe Mail, which is again in the description and the pinned comment. You'll receive immediate access to all exclusive updates from the Theories of Everything podcast. It also helps me communicate directly with the core toe community. You'll also receive my top 10 toes. Think of it as the intellectual version of Quentin Tarantino's Obsession.